This is a critical moment to mobilize the feminist and women's movement to develop an ambitious plan of action to celebrate Beijing Plus 25 next year. Indeed, the Beijing Fourth World Conference on Women was a major human rights milestone. It underscored the centrality of women's rights to the broader struggle for equality and sustainable development. And this was the first global conference in which gender and development issues were explicitly and inextricably linked with women's human rights. The resulting 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, adopted by 189 governments, built upon the human rights framework, notably the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And it is a declaration that deserves to be celebrated because in many ways it was extremely progressive and ahead of its time, particularly in its treatment of violence against women and of the plight and rights of women affected by armed conflict. In particular, it is worth recalling the words of paragraph 135 of the Declaration, which notes that while entire communities suffer the consequences of armed conflict and terrorism, women and girls are particularly affected because of their status in society and their sex. Parties to conflict often rape women with impunity, sometimes using systematic rape as a tactic of war and terrorism. My mandate to lead and cohere efforts across the UN system to end the surge of conflict-related sexual violence was really built on the foundations laid in Beijing. And it was this very language, framed by the women's movement, which provided a precedent for Security Council Resolution 1820 of 2008. This resolution condemns sexual violence as a tactic of war and an impediment to peace building, elevating the issue onto the agenda of the Security Council. Moreover, it was only in 2016, in the wake of well-documented sexual violence committed by ISIL and Boko Haram, that the Security Council officially recognized sexual violence as a tactic of terrorism. So it's important to note that the Beijing platform raised the alarm and helped to catalyze a shift in paradigm and perspective. And today, the notion of sexual violence as a tactic of war and terrorism, rather than a private tragedy, an inevitable byproduct of war, or mere collateral damage, has really traveled from the Beijing World Conference to the United Nations Security Council. Therefore, it is critical to connect the dots between collective peace and security and the iconic rallying of Beijing that women's rights are human rights. Taking sexual violence seriously as a tactic of war and terror has really lent new impetus to the inclusion of women and their perspectives in the restoration of peace. Strategies to protect women from sexual violence are also strategies to protect women's participation in the political, economic, and social sphere. After all, women cannot safely vote or contest elections. They cannot access universities or places of employment while living under the shadow of sexual violence committed in a climate of impunity. We also know that inequality is a root cause and invisible driver of sexual violence, enabling the dehumanization of women and emboldening the perpetrators. A life free from sexual and gender-based violence is not only a right in itself, it is a prerequisite to the realization of all other human rights. Human dignity depends on the right to physical and bodily integrity, and that right is universal. Conversely, sexual harassment and sexual violence, whether in a war zone or a workplace, is an inhibitor of gender equality and part of a system of oppression that often leads to ever greater seclusion and withdrawal of women and girls from public life. My mandate to combat sexual violence in conflict shows that we are still in pursuit of the Beijing platform. Last week, I commemorated the 10-year anniversary of my mandate by holding a survivors hearing and launching a new global fund to deliver reparations and assistance. The survivors who came to testify at this event embodied the extraordinary political courage it often takes to realize the most ordinary human rights: the right to speak their mind, to earn a living, to wear what they choose, to live how they choose, and to strive to fulfill their human potential, even in the midst of poverty, displacement, and war. 25 years after the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action, we are compelled to ask, have we delivered equality, peace, and development for women? And as we look back on the promise of the Beijing Declaration, we also look forward to a time when women will have far greater influence over peace, security, and development processes. For several reasons, 2020 will be a pivotal year. In addition to being the 20th anniversary of the Breakthrough Security Council Resolution on Women, Peace, and Security, Resolution 1325, it will also mark 75 years since the advent of the United Nations. This means that a lifetime has passed since the founding promise of equality between men and women was enshrined in the United Nations Charter of 1945. While it is important to celebrate gains, we must also use these anniversaries to take stock of remaining gaps and challenges. And there is a lot we have learned. We know that peace will not deliver peace or peace of mind for women if sexual and gender-based violence persists. That law will not deliver transformative justice for women if no reparations are made. And that development will not be inclusive or sustainable if the barriers to women's full social and economic participation are not dismantled through concerted global efforts. We also need to face the fact that we are living through a critical moment of backlash against women's rights. Virulent misogyny in public rhetoric and online, targeted attacks on women's human rights defenders, shrinking civic space, persecution based on sexual orientation and gender identity, pushback on sexual and reproductive rights, as well as a massive justice and accountability deficit when it comes to sexual violence crimes. The feminist movement will need to rekindle the activist flame that burned so brightly in Beijing in order to galvanize political resolve and financial resources equal to the scale of these challenges. In this effort, we are only as strong as our partnership. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So let us join hands and join forces in driving change. I believe that very little in human history is inevitable. It is often said that history repeats itself, but the truth is that people repeat history, or they make the choice to take a stand and change the world. Thank you for being part of that change. I stand with you and wish you every success.